So we gave the book the title of Fragmented Continent because there are three main groups in the region. And firstly, we look at Brazil in the basic group with South Africa, India and China. And we also look at the ALBA group with Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador and Bolivia. And then we look at the Independent Association of Latin America and the Caribbean, ILAC, which has Peru, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Paraguay and Panama, and now Honduras as well that just joined. And we look at these three groups because these groups have been particularly proactive at the negotiations, but pushing and pulling in very different directions on certain issues. Latin American countries do come together on some things, such as climate finance or the role of developed countries doing the heavy lifting on emission reductions. But there are some pretty distinct differences between these countries. And for instance, if we take one example, ILAC, for instance, is pushing for a long-term mitigation goal, which is probably the more ambitious long-term mitigation goal coming out of the region. Brazil has its reservations about that, so our understanding at the moment is they're not too keen on a long-term mitigation goal, and the ALBA countries, which are in the like-minded group, is not interested in specific figures for a long-term goal as far as we're aware at the moment. So we can see this kind of fragmentation on specific issues, and that's why we called it that in the book. Yeah. So
the Paris summit is in its third day. What kind of plays are we seeing from these groups or these countries in your mind?
So things have obviously just kicked off. So we've picked up a few interesting things just to start with, which are very different from what we've seen before. For instance, the fact that the US and Cuba have just reopened their embassies is very interesting. So we can actually see some diplomacy going on between these two countries, which hasn't happened for decades, quite frankly, which is remarkable. So the US Chief Climate Envoy was in Havana quite recently talking to the Cubans. So I think we can describe that as progress. Mexico has been pushing quite hard for some operational text in the new agreement on human rights, so it's not just stuck in the preamble. And we can see the ILAC countries emboldened by this new member coming in, Honduras, pushing a more consensual tone in the negotiations, trying to kind of look to build bridges between countries. But given they are part of the G77, there are some very powerful players in there which aren't necessarily that inclined to let developing countries play a more ambitious role. So I think what we can see at the moment is some very interesting configurations lining up.
Very good. And so why is a new climate agreement so important to the region?
Well, I think we can treat this question in three ways. Firstly, Latin America won't really be able to achieve prosperity unless emission reductions, or rather unless a global temperature is kept below 1.5 or 2 degrees, preferably 1.5. So it's very much in the interest of the region to achieve prosperity if the global temperatures can be kept below those thresholds. At the same time, I think this kind of transition to a low carbon economy, which a new agreement will hopefully kind of catalyze, presents considerable opportunities for the region, especially on clean energy, clean cities. Latin America has emerged as a very impressive region for renewable energy investment. So a new agreement could really send some great signals to policymakers and investors that this transition to a low carbon economy is happening. And then thirdly, the third thing was just the role of non-state actors. The negotiations have been very much closed off, for the most part, civil society, cities and the private sector. And what I think the INDC process in Latin America has done has to some extent opened up international climate policy for domestic audiences. And although participation in the INDCs in Latin American countries wasn't as great as it could be, at least there was a national conversation to some extent on the INDCs, and including these non-state actors, which going beyond Paris are going to play a key role both in job creation, investment, private sector, monitoring INDCs and trying to push or increase ambition of countries coming from civil society, and the role of the media as well, really trying to kind of increase attention to this issue as Latin America suffers increasing frequency and ferocity of climate impacts.
Guy, thanks very much.